I think there's 24 chapters. If I We'll actually do less than 24 weeks. We are going, because of the structure of this particular book, there'll be some times that we'll look at just one chapter, and there'll be some times that we look at as many as 3 chapters at a time, simply because they are interconnected. More than likely, we will not go verse by verse. We're going to hit the highlights of those 3 chapters. And so, for example, I'll give you a perfect example next week. We'll look at chapters 2 and 3 together, okay? But tonight, I want to look at chapter 1. Are we recording, Mike? Are we live? Let me just say a word to, first of all, thank you for those of you who have brave getting out tonight and coming. I know that there are some in our church who don't feel comfortable driving, and some are providentially hindered. I think Janice told me that she was on her way back from Austin on her way home. So, Janice, keep your eyes on the road, please, and be careful. But others are not able to be here. But here, if you are watching us online tonight, do me a huge favor. Chime in, say something, say, hey, watching from home in Silsbee, watching from home in Lumberton, Evadale, Kuntz, Beaumont, as my son was watching from Qatar, wherever it may be, right? And so let me know that you are watching, okay? We had somebody contact us a few years ago that was watching from Germany. Isn't it wonderful to know that God has provided a means by which people literally around the world can watch and hear the gospel? And I think it's kind of a precursor to what the book of Revelation is talking about, that the whole world will see and know. And I just think that's pretty exciting. But we are in 2 Samuel chapter 1 tonight. There are, I think, is it 24 verses? 24 verses in this first chapter. And I think it can be divided into 2 sections. We'll point those out here in just a moment. But let's just kind of catch us up to speed to where we are. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, and it recorded for us the death of Saul. Saul and his 3 sons had gone into battle with a group known as the Philistines, right? And Saul was mortally wounded, but rather than dying at the hands of these ungodly people, he turns to his armor bearer and he said, hey, thrust me through, finish me off, so to speak. Remember, the armor bearer said, no way, no how. I can't do that, right? And so what does Saul do? Saul takes his own sword, and he falls on that sword, and as a result, he dies. And the armor bearer, seeing that his king, who he is servant to, has died, falls on his sword, and he dies. Now, keep in mind that while this battle is going on, almost simultaneously in chapter 30, David is doing battles, or maybe a day ahead of doing battles with the Amalekites. Remember, David wanted to go into battle with the Philistines, and who knows what role he would have served. I think somehow that he would have preserved his own people, but the Philistine king was talked out of allowing David to go by his own generals. Remember that? And send him back. David goes back to Ziklag in his territory, and he discovers something. Remember that? The entire town lays in ruin, destruction, and not only that, the women and the children had been taken captive. And so God used the king of the Philistines from keeping David and going into battle with the Philistines against his own people. David used that as an opportunity to have him go into battle with the Amalekites, by the way, which is a people group that Saul should have wiped out all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15 when God told him to do that. Don't leave anything standing. Did he do that? No, he didn't. And as a result, now you've got even more problems. What did David do? So David prayed and asked God, what do you want me to do? And God, by his own providential hand, allowed David to go and find the Amalekites, remember that? And wipe the majority of them out, right? Only their servants. Did a little bit more research. We talked about who were those extra 400. These were more likely slaves of the Amalekites, right? That had escaped. And as a result, what did David do? He got his wives, his women, and his children, and they got them back. And now they've come back. You say, why are you telling us all that? Because this is kind of where the story picks up here in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. In fact, you look at verse 1. It says this, "Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David stayed 2 days in Ziklag." Okay, so David is 2 days removed from his own battle. And at this point in verse 1, David is unaware. Obviously, he's aware that Israel had gone into battle with the Philistines, but he's unaware of the results and how things are going. He does not know that Saul is dead. You say, how do you know that? Because we're going to continue to read. He's going to ask, hey, how are things going? Because this guy's going to come up and say, I've come from the battle. Well, give me an update. Now keep in mind, they didn't have Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T. They didn't have email back then. They didn't even have beepers back then. Really dating us now, right? Anybody remember the beeper days? I remember my very first pastorate, they absolutely demanded that I have a beeper. Okay, we didn't have cell phones, and so I would wear that beeper, and that thing would go beep, 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 beep. And guess what? I'd be on the road somewhere, not have access to phone. I had to go pull off at a convenience store, right, and use a pay phone, right? And I wouldn't, and then you couldn't use credit cards for them things. I didn't have coins on me, so I made it a habit of keeping coins in my quarters in my car in order that I might use the pay phone to call back whoever was trying to beat me. Boy, I'll tell you something. I don't miss those days.
Was it a quarter or a nickel?
I think back then it was a quarter, okay? Okay, all right. Some of you much older than I am, right? But I think it was quarters back in the day to make just a simple phone call. I don't miss those days of the people. But David didn't have these access, and so basically, they would wait for runners, if you will, to come back from the war or messengers to come back and let them know what was going on. So here's what I want to do. Let me just read through this entire chapter, and then we'll come back and unpack it, okay? It says, this is 2 Samuel chapter 1. It came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David stayed 2 days in Ziklag. So David has gone back. Now keep in mind, where is Ziklag? Not necessarily specifically where it is, but whose territory is it in? It's in the Philistine territory, okay? Now remember that, because I'm going to come back and talk about that in just a moment, because it's going to play a role. And it says, on the third day, okay, behold, it happened that a man from Saul's camp, watch this, with his clothes torn and dust on his head. So get this image. He's got his garments torn, and there's dirt on his head, which is a sign of mourning, okay? So on the third day, behold, it happened that a man from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head, so it was that he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. One's not the other. Verse 3. And David said to him, where have you come from? And notice what he says. He said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. Now, we know him to be a liar here, because we'll find this out later. Then David said to him, how did the matter go? Please tell me. And he answered, the people have fled from the battle. Many of the people have fallen and are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, are what? Dead also. So David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead? Again, David does not know. He's going off the words of this guy. Then the young man said, as I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear, and indeed the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. Now when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, please stand over me and kill me, for anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me. So I stood over him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord. In other words, he's showing proof that he's dead, right? Therefore David took hold of his own clothes, tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord, for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Verse 13, then David said to the young man who told him, where are you from? And notice what he says. This is interesting here. He answered and he says, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. Now, where did he say back in verse 3? He says, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. Okay, we'll talk about this just a moment. Verse 14. So David said to him, how was it that you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the young men and said, go near and... Y'all know what that means, right? And he struck him so that he died. So David said to him, your blood is on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Now, verse 17 through 27, this is often referred to as a song of lament. Just read it. David makes some interesting statements here. And then David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son, and he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. This is part of what the title of this song was, Song of the Bow. Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher. We'll come back and talk about that in a moment. He says, the beauty of Israel is slain on your high places, and how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for the shield of the mighty is cast away there, and the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan, for you have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. And how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. Well, David, again, is roughly 3 days removed from his own battle with the Amalekites. And think about this. For about a period of 10 years, David had been on the run from Saul. And think about that. I don't know about you. 10 years is a significant amount of time to be on the run. And I think about this. David is not only on the run, but everywhere he goes, he knows that there is a price on his head. And what was the price? It was death. Why? Because Saul was bound and determined to kill David. And so David's been on the run for about 10 years. He's been kind of a fugitive, for lack of better ways of putting it, right? And so now the time has come. He's about to get news that what we would often consider, hey, David's enemy, but David never referred to Saul as an enemy. In fact, you're going to see here that he's going to praise Saul. He's going to speak of Saul in the presence of the children of Israel, in a very positive light. And I think if nothing else, it shows this to us. It ought to speak this to us, that it speaks of David's humility, right? And how God, in this 10-year period of time, even though we think, man, what a wasted years of 10 years. No, this was not wasted 10 years in the life of David from God's perspective. We often think about those times that you and I go through hardships and difficulty, thinking, man, I don't want to go back through those years at all. But you know what? It doesn't matter what comes our way, good, bad, or indifferent. Those are not wasted moments in God's eyes. God is using those moments to mature us, to refine us, to make us more like the Lord, to teach us more dependence upon God and whatnot, right? And so God used this in the life of David, not just to keep him humble, but also to prepare him to be the next king, even though he had already been anointed. Way back in chapter 16, he was anointed by Samuel to be the, of 1 Samuel 16, he was anointed to be the king of Israel. But he had to wait, again, nearly 10 years for it become realized in his own life. Well, again, I think this teaches us some leadership. It teaches us some humility. And it also teaches us how God had matured David. Now, was David perfect? Absolutely not. But yet, he's referred to as a man after God's own heart. And I think we're going to see some of this as we continue to get deeper into 2 Samuel, because really the entire book is about David and his reign as king. Well, Victory Day, if you will, had finally come, but David was very careful not to force himself on the people upon hearing the death of Saul. Okay, your king is now dead. I have been anointed king. You guys follow me now. David never does that. Never does that. What does he do? He honors Saul, their king, who again, many of them were still loyal to. He honors them in front of the people so that they can say, you know what, David was not out to get him. Because after all, David wanted them to know that although I was an enemy to Saul, Saul was never an enemy to me. Okay? Now, if you were going to divide this chapter, you would divide it into two sections. One, let me go and give you the two major points here, okay? Don't start filling in those subpoints just yet. But there's one word I think describes verses 1 through 16, and I think you'll see it realized in just a moment. It's the word vindication. Vindication. David not only vindicates himself, but he also vindicates King Saul. Even though Saul had done a lot of things, and we think, man, we'd look at Saul's life and his reign as king as utter failure. But David's going to speak of the good things that Saul had done. And so vindication would be the word that I would describe verses 1 through 16. Okay? Verses 17 through 27, here's the word I would use for that. I would use lamentation. Lamentation, because David writes a eulogy, if you will, a song of lament for what has taken place in the life of Saul and his three sons and how it impacts the kingdom or the nation of Israel. So vindication, verses 1 through 16, and lamentation, verses 17 through 27. Well, let's think about vindication just for a little bit. Now, again, the Lord had prevented David and his men from assisting the Philistines in their battle against Saul and Israel. And so David was sent by God's providential hand to go back to Ziklag. And what had happened when he got there, he discovered that the Amalekites had ransacked Ziklag and left it in ruin, took the spoils, took the women, took the children. And upon praying and asking God, what should I do? God, by his providential hand, allowed David to find not only where the Amalekites were, but to defeat them, gather all of the spoils that the Amalekites had previously taken from their raid, and to bring back David's wives and the men's wives and their children and reclaim all the things that the Amalekites had taken from them. But upon returning to Ziklag, what is it that David discovers? You go back to chapter 29 and 30, again, we see the battle of the Philistines in chapter 31, rather. And David discovers now 3 days after that, what? Some terrible, terrible news. Well, what you have in verses 1 through 10 is this. We see a deceitful messenger. A deceitful messenger. On that day, David was, while he was slaughtering the Amalekites, the Philistines were overpowering Saul and his Israeli army at Mount Gilboa. And this is where Saul died along with his three sons. We know that to be true back in chapter 31. The next day, while returning to Ziklag, the Philistines, what do they begin to do with Saul's body? They began to tear it apart, right? They decapitated the head, right? They hung the bodies of Saul and his sons upon a wall, right? But now here comes a messenger who describes himself as an Amalekite. And by the way, it would have taken him 3 days to get from where he was to where David is, okay, which is about an 80-mile journey from the scene of the battle to where David was. And it's on this third day that in Ziklag that the terrible news that Israel, not only has Saul and his sons died, but Israel had been terribly defeated. Now, I want you to write in your notes somewhere, when we think about this deceitful messenger, this, because we're going to look at it in a little bit more depth in just a moment. 3 times in Scripture, we are told that Saul died. Okay, 3 times we're told in Scripture. Let me give you those verses. 1 Samuel 31, right? Verses 1 through 10, I believe it is. We discover that Saul has died. Obviously, here in 2 Samuel 1, right, this messenger comes and tells us that Saul has died. And then again in 1 Chronicles, chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, we are told that Saul has died. And you say, what's the big deal about it? What's the significance of that? Stay with me. 3 times we are told, we are given the accounts of Saul's death. Now, we know from both the accounts of 1 Samuel 31 and the account of 1 Chronicles chapter 10, how did Saul die? He fell on his own sword. In other words, now obviously he was mortally wounded, and obviously the Philistines, had they caught up with him, they would have finished him off, okay? Because he's not in a position to defend himself anymore. And so rather than dying literally at the hands of these chief enemies of the nation of Israel, he decides himself that he's going to kill himself. But there is a verse that I want to draw your attention to. Okay, 3 times in Scripture we're given the fact that Saul is dead, okay? 2 of the accounts we're told that Saul kills himself. 1 of the accounts we're told that somebody else killed Saul. Where was that found? What we just read. There you go. Now here's what I find interesting. If you look at 1 Chronicles chapter 10, lock in on verse 14. Who takes credit for killing Saul? 1 Chronicles 10, verse 14. You actually look at verse 13 just for context purposes. This is God speaking. It says, and so Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, also because he consulted a medium for guidance, but did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore, he, or the Lord, killed him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. And the question is, how do you reconcile these? Absolutely. So did Saul kill himself, or did God kill him? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, because if you remember, back in chapter 28, I believe it is, or chapter 29, I can't remember which chapter it is, when Saul was nervous, he went to see the witch of Endor. Remember that? And she says, this is not a good idea, because if Saul finds out about this, it's not going to be good. And later she'll discover it was Saul. He said, don't worry about it. And she said, well, who do you want me to call up? And he says, I want you to call up Samuel. Remember when Samuel came up? Again, I don't know how God did that, but God chose to do it. Hey, is it going to be, what does God have to say to me? He says, God's got nothing to say to you. Everything that God said, he's already said, right? And so here's what's going to happen. By this time tomorrow, you're going to be just like me. Dead. Right? And literally, that's exactly what happened 24 hours later. By God's providence, by God's sovereignty, Saul was dead. Yes, he took his own life, but God had already predetermined that for Saul. So, one of 2 people is lying. Okay, either God is lying or this Amalekite is lying. The Amalekite is lying. Okay, if it's ever Brother Bill's word versus God's word, Brother Bill is lying. Okay, God's word is truth. I'm coming to that. I'm coming to that. Absolutely. And you're going to see that when we get to verse, let's see, verse 11. I think he's absolutely shocked at how David and the people react to hearing this news. He's thinking, why are y'all mourning? I thought you'd be excited about this, right? And I think, like Karen said, I think he really thought, hey, look what I brought you. I think he truly thought that he was going to be rewarded. But let's get to that when we get to that, okay? So we see this deceitful messenger. Again, there's no doubt. Is there any doubt that the messenger had found the body of Saul? There's no doubt that he had been in the battlefield, right? After all, he has Saul's most precious possessions, right? He's got the crown, he's got the bracelet, he's got all of these things. And I think, how did he get that? Why didn't the Philistines take that? No, I think that the Philistines would have absolutely loved to have had those relics, right? But they hadn't got to him yet. He had found Saul's body before the Philistines had got to him. Because I think what you're going to see, and this is my personal opinion about this guy, he was probably a guy who had heard about the biggest and the baddest military in the world at that particular time, the Philistines, and probably thought, I'm just going to kind of get in the trail here, and I'm just going to follow them as they knock off this group and knock off that group, and I'm going to make my living by sneaking around and taking of the spoils of the battle. I think that's exactly who this guy is, what he's trying to do, right? And so I think he's trying to capitalize on kind of like on YouTube. You ever watch YouTube videos? And I don't know why I follow or subscribe to these guys who go to garage sales and sell stuff on eBay. Okay, I'm never going to do that. That doesn't attract, but I'm always fascinated. If they go buy stuff really dirt cheap and sell it for 10 times what they bought it at a garage sale, right? And so this guy's taking the spoils thinking, I'm going to get rewarded for this. I bought something for, 10 cents and now I'm going to make $100 off of it, And so I'm just kind of, forgive me, I'm chasing a rabbit there. Okay. Now, let me point out something to you. If you don't mind writing in your Bibles, I think there's 4 times. 1, 2, 3. No, 5 times. 5 times in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we read the word fallen. Let me point them out to you. Verse 4. The second paragraph says, and he answered, and the people have fled from the battle, and many of the people are fallen. Fast forward to verse 10. He talks about how he killed Saul. He said, so I stood over him and killed him because I was sure that he could not live after he had jump down to verse 12. And they mourned and wept and fasted even until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord, for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Let me give you 2 more references. In his lament, verse 19, he says, the beauty of Israel is slain on your high places, how the mighty have fallen, how the mighty have fallen. Verse 27, how the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war, he says, are perished. Now you think about this. How is Saul described right before he's anointed to be the king of Israel? Does anybody remember how he's described? He is literally head and shoulders above the people. That's just how, he's just a big dude. But yet when you come to, I can't remember if it's chapter 28, I think it's chapter 28. When he comes to the witch at Endor, the Bible says that he fell on his face in front of the witch. But then you come to chapter 31, he's now fallen on his face before the mortal enemy because he's dead. Once stood head and shoulders taller than the people, but now he has fallen. The taller they are, the harder they fall. So we see, first of all, this deceitful messenger. Number 2, look at verse 11 and 12. We see a grieving camp. Now, Karen mentioned this a while ago, and I think it bears worth repeating. Can you imagine, put yourself in this just for a moment. I wouldn't want to be in for very long because we know what happens to him. But put yourself in the shoes of this deceitful messenger just for a moment. I mean, he's thinking, man, hey, when does the reward kick in? But he tells David this news. Not only is Saul dead, but I did it. I did you a favor. But look at the reaction that David and his people have. We see a grieving camp. That's what that second blank is, a grieving camp. Look what happens. Verse 11 says, now watch this. And David took hold of his own clothes, and what did he do? He tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. This wasn't just David in mourning. Okay, this was the culture of that day. Verse 12 says that they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and the people of the Lord, for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Can you imagine the shock on the face of this deceitful messenger? Again, I think he fully expected to be rewarded, but why would he be shocked? Because he did not know the heart of David. Yeah, because remember, David had two opportunities that we know of to knock off Saul, but each time he made this statement, I shall not touch God's anointed. In David's eyes, again, Saul was never the enemy. But then that leads us to the third thing. Not only deceitful messenger in a grieving camp, but then we see a righteous judgment. Look what happens in verse 13, 14, 15, and 16. David wants to know more about this particular messenger. He's already described himself as being an Amalekite. He also described himself as coming from the camp of Israel. Now in verse 13, David says to the young man who told him, he said, hey, where are you from? He begins to interrogate him. And notice what he says. He answered this. He says, I am the son of an alien. Okay, don't think about orbital aliens. Think about the term, how we use it today. We think about illegal aliens. We think about here illegally. They've not come legally into our country. So this guy's prescribing himself as, you know what? I am an Amalekite, but I've been living in Israel for a long time. Well, if that were true, which it is not, he himself would have known how beloved Saul was in the people's eyes, and that he, no doubt, had heard that Saul, being the king, was God's anointed. But yet, what does he claim to have done? He claims to have killed God's anointed. Now, keep in mind, who are the Amalekites? They are among the chiefest of the enemies of Israel. And again, why are they still around? Because Saul had failed to do that. Now, again, this guy more than likely was a genuine Amalekite. I don't question that at all. Otherwise, why would he label himself that way? But he was more than likely, as I mentioned a while ago, getting in behind the Philistines and going in and making his trade, making his living off the spoils of all the things that the Philistines had done. Okay. Now he's in Ziklag again, which is Philistine territory. Now David takes great risk here. You say, why do you say that? Because look what David does. And David said to him, how was it that you were not afraid? He said, if what you say is true, how is it that you weren't afraid to put forth your hand to destroy God's anointed? And what does David order to be done? Verse 15 and 16. Then David called one of the young men and said, go near and execute him. And he struck him so that he was dead. Verse 16 says, and David said to him, talking about this dead man, he says, your blood is on your own head. If what you say is true, then you've got what's coming to you. For your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Let me just pause there just for a moment. Let's just talk about this for a little bit. Think about the risk that David has taken in even doing this. You say, what are you talking about? Again, where is he? He's in Ziklag, which is still where? In Philistine territory. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, here's the big deal about that. As far as King Achish is concerned, David is still an ally. He still thinks that David hates and despises Saul, even though David has never given an indication other than moving to the Philistine territory, right? And so if he gets wind that David and his camp are mourning over Saul and his sons in the defeat of Israel, and now he has killed someone who is claimed to have killed the king, does that put David and his men in danger? Oh, yes. Indeed it does. Does that deter David from doing what he believes to be right? Absolutely not. This is a big deal, in my opinion. Do y'all see it? This is a big deal. Because David still does what is right.
One other observation, maybe. The messenger, the Amalekite that came, didn't realize David had just come back from destroying the very tribe that he was coming from.
That's exactly right. If you didn't hear what Karen just said, and she makes a very, very, very good point, this Amalekite is unaware that David had just come back from a battle with the Amalekites.
He's been following the Silsbee, getting all the little rewards and the spoils and everything.
He was probably a dead man walking anyway, right?
He's what you call today an ambulance chaser. They're dying and they're wanting to get
I don't want to be sued. But every time I go to a Houston hospital, and I'm on my way back, there is a building that I think it's Jim Adler. It's called the Texas Hammer. I remember back in the days when I would be home during the day. You can't watch any TV show, Andy Griffith, whatever it may be, my favorite show. I'm thinking, man, it's attorneys like this that prey on senior adults because he knows they're the ones at home, retirees. Thanks a lot, Barbara. You just distracted me with something I was just thinking about.
Remind me to tell you a joke after this is over.
Now, here's the point. We think about why did we call verses 1 through 16 vindication? I'll tell you why. Because David has vindicated Saul. He has stood up for Saul. Saul was not the enemy in David's life. Even though David was considered an enemy to Saul, David did not consider Saul his enemy. In fact, he vindicated him. In fact, David still doesn't know the truth of what's happened to Saul other than he's dead. This guy is taking claim. That's why he says in verse 16, hey, your blood cries out against you, right? You're to blame yourself. You're dead because this is what you said, okay? If you didn't do that, then you shouldn't have said what you said. Right? So David is vindicating not only that, but guess what? He's also vindicating himself in the eyes of the people because they're seeing, hey, I thought David was against Saul. But what is he doing? He's standing up for Saul. He's singing Saul and Jonathan's praises. And so guess what? He's scoring points in the eyes of the people of Israel. Well, let's move on to this second final thing. We think about lamentation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this, but I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights here because I've already read it. Again, this is a song or a poem of lamentation. In fact, I want you to hold your finger there and go with me to the book of Joshua. He talks about in verse 18 of 2 Samuel 1. Let me just read verse 17 and 18 again. He says, and David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And he told them, David has written out this poem, this lamentation, this eulogy, this song, and he gives it a title. It's called The Song of the Bow. And he said, indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher. If you'll go to the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter, I wrote it down, chapter 10. And look at verse 12 and 13. Uh, 12 and 13. Joshua chapter 10, verse 12 and 13. You find this book of Jasher comes up again. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites, different from the Amalekites, before the children of Israel, and said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still over Gibeon, moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Now watch this. Is it not written where? In the book of Jasher. So the sun stood still in the midst of heavens and did not hasten to go down for a whole day. So what's the significance? This book of Jasher seems to have been some type of book that contained poems and songs that commemorated the great events in Israel's history. Okay, that's what the book of Jasher is about. Now, go back to our text. Let me just point out 5 quick things real quick. David's going to address or praise 5 groups or 5 things in verses 17 through 20. Again, I'm going to just hit the highlights here. I'm not going to even reread these. He addresses the people of Israel. And what David does is he urges the people not to spread the bad news that Israel has been defeated and that Saul is dead. Now, they're going to eventually find out, because I guarantee you, who's going to make that known? The Philistines will. The Philistines most certainly will. In fact, he mentions 2 cities. Did you notice that? In verse 20, he says, "Tell it not in Gath." Now, Gath, as you remember, now keep in mind, they're in Philistine territory right now, being in Ziklag. But Gath was the capital city of the Philistines. And then he mentions this Ashkelon, which was the religious center of the Philistine people. This is where all their idols are. I can guarantee you they're going to go back there and they're going to worship and praise their idols, because they're going to give credit to their idols for giving them victory over the nation of Israel. But reality is God allowed it because he was chastising his own people. So in verses 17 through 20, he addresses the people of Israel. Now, this is interesting. Verse 21, who's he speaking to? The very first sentence. He says, "And O mountains of Gilboa." David addresses the mountains of Gilboa. Well, what's the significance of that? This is where the battle was fought and Saul lost his life. David prayed. Now, look at the prayer he says here. So he's, "Let no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for the shield of the mighty is cast away, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil," which, by the way, was a tradition that oftentimes they would take their shields and they would anoint it with oil, believing that God would protect them from the enemy. But David pretty much calls on the mountains of Gilboa, right? He's asking, this is a prayer, God, don't let rain or dew fall upon them, because I'm asking, not only are we as your people mourning, but we're also asking that even creation mourn over what's taking place there. Now think about the consequences of this. If it doesn't rain and no dew falls upon it, what happens? Everything dies, including the grain. So this would prohibit any potential farmers from raising grain to be used as a grain offering to God. Wow. Something to think about, right? Verse 17 to 20, he addresses the people of Israel. Verses 21, he addresses the mountains of Gilboa. Verse 22 and 23, I find this very interesting. He says, "In the blood of the slain from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty." Here's what he's saying is, you know what? As bad as things just happened in the life of Saul and Jonathan, they lost their lives, be reminded of this, that Saul also brought many victories to the nation of Israel, made Israel a safer place, right? And the economy had increased in the nation of Israel under the leadership of Saul. In fact, verse 23, he says, Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives. And he says, even in their death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, and they were stronger than lions. So think about this. Did Saul know that he was going to die? He was told that he was going to die, but he went anyway. Not often are we going to know when we're going to die. Saul knew, hey, within the next 24 hours, you're going to be dead. Saul could have said, man, I'm just not going to go. I'm going to go home and go to bed. Probably wouldn't have mattered. That's exactly right. But guess what? He went into battle anyway. And not only did he go into battle, but guess what? Jonathan and his sons also went into battle, and they lost their lives. So David praises Saul and Jonathan. He again, emphasizing their greatness here, not their failures, but their greatness. Verse 24 is also something very interesting here. He talks about, O daughters of Israel. So David addresses the daughters of Jerusalem. Who is this group? Who is this group? Notice what he says. He talks about their wealth. He says, O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. More than likely, this was probably going to be the wives of Saul's chiefest generals, his cabinet, if you will. He said, look, he said, don't forget, you benefited from Saul. Saul made you wealthy. What you have is a direct credit to what Saul has done for you. Again, even in Saul's death, what is David doing? He's continuing to speak very highly of Saul. Man, I don't know about you and me. I don't know that many of us, myself included, could have done that. We probably think, man, thank God that my thorn in the flesh is dead or is now gone. Or we would have thought, you had it coming. But that's not what David does here. Is it any wonder he was a man after God's own heart? And then last but not least, David speaks of his beloved friend, Jonathan. Look at verse 25 through 27. I want to address verse 26 because this has become a battle cry among Bible critics. Verse 25 says, and how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in high places. And then lock your eyes in on verse 26 and the wording here. He says, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me, and your love to me was wonderful, including, he says, suppressing the love of women. A lot of Bible critics have used this verse to advocate that David and Jonathan were homosexuals, or they had some kind of immoral relationship. I'm going to say there's a good Hebrew word for that, and it's baloney, right? Absolutely not. If you know anything about David, David didn't have a problem with loving women. Some to his undoing, right? I don't believe that what David is talking about here is that he has such a kindred spirit with his best buddy that Jonathan was a ministry to him. That's the point, right? They had made a covenant with each other, right? They had made a covenant. It is that brotherly love, right? Yeah. Phileo, where we get the word Philadelphia, right? Brotherly love, yeah. A very kindred spirit, right? And so David speaks to his beloved friend Jonathan. Verse 27, just wrapping up. He says, how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war are perished. Questions, comments, feedback, thoughts? Yes. I take it. I bring it.
Even if the Amalekite had killed Saul, it was still God.
Say it again.
Even if it had been,
Absolutely.
it was still God.
Absolutely. Yeah. Saul was going to die
Right.
one way or the other, whether he took his own life or the Amalekite. Right. But this does not excuse the Amalekite from lying and trying to take credit where he shouldn't have. And being Amalekite, right? An enemy of the Israelites, right? Right. He was not, I think in his heart of heart, he didn't care if he was doing a favor for David. Where's the reward? Yeah, he got his reward, all right. Yeah. Be careful what you say.
Because what he had in his hands was pretty
Sacred. Sacred. There's no way Saul would have willingly given him those things. He wouldn't have said, hey, I'm dying. Take these to David. No chance.
But that's where they ended up.
Yeah. And I think because of God. Y'all looking forward to 2 Samuel? It's going to be good. It's going to be a good study. All right. Any other word, comment, thought?